Good day. My name is Michael Molondo, and I'm going to present on the subject of psychological counseling at certificate level, code PC20S2. We are going to cover the following subjects, or the following section, which is on the introduction of counseling. So I'm going to give a small overview on what is counseling and just an introduction introduction on counseling. Then we're going to look at the psychological counseling, the different practices, and what is entailed when it comes to psychological counseling. Then the issue of ethics, very important subject, and then also how do you apply ethics in counseling. Then we are going to look at the guidelines of counseling. Then we will also look what intervention you have to take when you do HIV counseling. And then what are the needs of young people and adults when it comes to counseling? Because when you counsel people, they've got different needs, and comparing to the adolescents, the youth, and the adults, how do you apply the different counseling skills as per their needs? Then we are going to conclude on how to create awareness among the community with regard to the importance of psychological counseling. So as an introduction, counseling is a process, and normally when you have a counseling session, two people are involved. It's a counselor and a client, and it's very important that you only have two people because of confidentiality and privacy. The counselor needs to make sure that there is no third party involved. It's only the counselor himself or herself and the client. So it's a whole process between the two where both parties then will explore the difficulties which the client is experiencing, and then also look at other feelings which are psychotic or non-psychotic, but mostly which produce stressful and emotional feelings within the client. So it's a process, and counseling it's not a shortcut to solution. It's normally a long process, and you have to be patient, especially when you're counseling a client. The other thing is counseling is actually a way of saying I want to help someone. It's an act of helping someone, and many times the client feel very isolated, feel very vulnerable, and sometimes when a client comes to for a counseling session, the client feels there is no hope and there is no help for his or her problem. And that's why as a counselor you have to make sure that the client must know that you are there to help him. Not necessarily give him the solution, but just being a guide and to guide this client so that the client can make the right decision. So it also is aspects of behavior and how the behavior, different behavior can also change or influence the client. Thirdly, counseling is all about trust. Just the fact that the client comes to you and sit in your office and talk to you, it's already a sign of trust. That client is putting trust in you. And it's very important because of that client, the client must feel that there is a sense of confidentiality, and professionalism is very important for a counselor, because this client comes to you and he or she is disclosing herself or her privacy and her vulnerability or his vulnerability. So that's why it's very important to know that when you are in the counseling session, the client must feel that he or she can trust you. And that's the whole process of counseling, or the elements that entail counseling. And also by law, it is required that you are not obliged as a counselor to divulge or expose the privacy of the client. So it's very important to uphold the client confidentiality as much as possible, because by law you are actually required, because this client puts his or her life at risk just coming to you for this counseling. So it's very important to note. So those are the elements of counseling, and just as an introduction for you. Now, if you are going to engage in psychological counseling, or you're going to counsel someone, there are certain practices that you have to look at, and which you have to be very sensitive, or you have to be aware about. One of the aspect that you need to look at is its cultural sensitivity, because you are dealing with different people with different background, with different cultures, different norms, and they've got different views about life and about issues of life. So when you as a counselor, you are counseling someone, you have to be very sensitive and very cognizant that when that person comes to you, that person is coming with a preconceived idea which is shaped or influenced by cultural norms and practices. So be very sensitive, because at the end of the day is you want to help this client. You want to make sure that you improve the well-being of this client. So it's very important to make sure that when you are engaged in a counseling session, you have to be very sensitive, cultural sensitive. The other thing is the stress. And when a client comes to you, they're so much stressed within the client, and you need to develop a skill how you can alleviate the stress within the client, so that the client can feel comfortable and the client can feel at ease, knowing that the client, that you are there to facilitate the client through the process of dealing with his or her distress situation. So it's very important to know that. Many a times also the client will come with a crisis, because once a client comes to you, that the client feels that he or her situation is a very critical situation. The question is, how are you going to resolve those crises? So it's not that you are giving the solution, but you are guiding this client to look at options that might solve the problem, or that might alleviate the situation which the client is experiencing. The other thing that one has to look at as a psychological counselor is you need to increase the ability for this client to feel that he or she can function better. Although the problem is not the question is, how is this client going to cope with the situation now? Cope with that circumstances. And it is your responsibility as a client to make sure and to convince the client that he or she is having the ability to better her life or his life. And many times it's just because of ignorance that clients are making wrong decisions, and which actually influence their lives and also their circumstances. So it's very important to know that during your psychological session, you have to make sure that you give the client the ability or the option to make the right choices. And then the other thing that you have to look on is to look at the issues that the client is experiencing. And it's very important to be very specific, and the client must feel that you are dealing with his or her problem. Don't generalize problems or bring up issues which are not applicable to the client. So that's why, as a counseling, for you to focus on the issues and the problem of the client, you need to learn the skills of listening to the client. And the more you listen to the client, the more you will focus on that specific issue and the problem of the client, because the client is having so many situations or so many problems which might affect her or him physically, emotionally, and also mental. So your approach must be holistic. You need to have an holistic approach where you look at the physical, the mental, and the emotional aspect of the client, which is very important. So the issue of ethics, there are so many school of thoughts when it comes to ethics and counseling and different interpretation. But the purpose of this study or this module is just to give you a basic guideline how you can apply different scenarios when it comes to counseling. And one of them, remember I talked about confidentiality in my early slides. Now, when it comes to ethics, it's very important that you need to apply ethical principles, because ethics is the most important. Those are the foundational principles that you need to apply when it comes to counseling. Now, when we look at the word ethics, it comes from the Greek word ethos, which means it's the character of the person, and which is the most thing. And you, with that, you are actually exploring then the concept of right and wrong. So when you find yourself in a situation where you know that what you are doing is right and wrong, don't just that decision or that emotion or that feeling that whether this is right or wrong. That's the whole basis of ethics. And ethics is looking at that you have to have an idea that what you are doing is wrong or is it right. And your character plays a very much. So it's very important as a counselor, you need to have certain principles, and you need to have integrity. And once a client comes to you, it's one of the most important responsibility that you have, and that's why it's very important to have ethics. Now, there are certain ethical values that you have to consider, which is globally accepted or accepted standards which you have to apply. So we're going to look at different values of counseling, which is part of your ethical values, which you have to apply. The first thing is respect. You need to feel you need to respect your client. The moment the client walks into your office and you spend time, the client must have a sense of dignity. And dignity only comes through respect. And once you apply that skills and you make the client feel respected, and also their rights also respected, so it will make the counseling session very important. So the principle of human rights and dignity is very important, because every person, every human being that comes to you must feel that she or he is having a sense of dignity. So every person is very important, so you have to adhere to that. The other thing is protecting the safety of the client. When a client comes in, especially when you deal with a counseling session with children, that child that went through a very difficult situation, whether it's abuse, the client, which normally a child must feel very safe, and safety of clients is the most important part, especially a woman that went through sexual abuse and through a very dramatic experience. So a client must feel that he or she is safe in your environment. The other aspect or a value that you have to look at is integrity. You as a client there needs to be a sense where a client feels that you are a man or a woman of integrity, that he or she can trust you. And that relationship between counselor and client is the most important relationship, because the relationship is built on trust. And I've mentioned earlier about trust, because once a client feels that he or she can trust you, then it will make the counseling session very. So integrity is very important, and integrity also goes along with transparency, because the client must know that you are there for him or her, not just for yourself. And then also distress. I've talked about distress in my earlier slide. And also the most important thing is the sense of self-worth. The client must feel that he or she is worthy. The fact that you are spending time, the fact that you're making time for that client, that self-worth, the client must have that value, that she or he must value herself, and you need to give those value to the client. And then also personal effectiveness, which is very important, because all the counseling session is based on personal, and it's so important to know that when the client is standing or sitting with you and you are going through that session, you have to adhere to this value. So these are basic values that you can look at. There are also other principles which are also internationally accepted. And I'm quickly going to go through them. The first one is trustworthiness. We have talked so much about trust. Trust and honor, trust and respect is actually the most important and foundational. And you need to earn it as a counselor. You can't just expect a client to respect you or expect the client to respect you. You have to earn it. You have to prove yourself as a counselor that this client can respect you. So trustworthiness is very, very important as a counselor. The other one is autonomy. Which means is that you're only respecting the rights of the client, and the client needs to feel that he or she is having the right to make her own decision. It's not that you are enforcing your own thoughts or your suggestions to the client, but at the end of the day, because of that autonomy and that independence, the client must know he or she can make her or his independent decision. Beneficence, it's also very important, where you have to look at the totality of the client. You are looking at the well-being of the client. Once you are finished with that counseling session, the moment when the clients walk out of your practice or out of your office, the client must feel that sense of well-being, that he or she actually achieves something or reach a place. Now, and also that sense that the client knows he or she can make the right decision in a situation. Non-maleficence, it's also another one which look at the harm. So you want to avoid harm to the child. So the moment when a person that went through a traumatic experience comes to your office, that client must feel protected, that he or she will not be harmed. And it's very important that you need to give those values or those thoughts to the client. The other one is justice. The client must feel that the session with you is very fair, and the client must feel that you have treated them well. And it's very important to have this self-respect, as I've mentioned before. It's also important that you need to give the client that sense of self-respect, which is very important. There are certain guidelines that we are going to look through for counseling, and these are actually a recommendation which is given by UNH and by the World Health Organization. It's just basic guidelines that you can follow when it comes to psychological counseling, and this is also looking at the national perspective as a country, how you can apply what you need to have when you want to have an effective counseling or psychological counseling. The first one is you need to have policies, and these policies needs to be in line with legislation and of course different charters and national policies. So whenever you want to design or have a psychological counseling service, you need to make sure that it's based on policies and public legislation. And then the other guideline recommendation which is giving is when you are having consultation with counselors, it is very important that you cannot just implement a counseling service. You need to do consultation with all the stakeholders, which include the counselors, the government, and also the community that are affected. So it's very important to make sure. Then you have to provide training for caregivers and also for counseling. And when it comes to counseling, there are so many it's ever evolving, especially when it comes to different principles, skills, and different scenarios. So it's important to give ongoing training to your counselors so that they can be up to date with current knowledge and experience and best practices of counseling. Then the other recommendation which is given is you have to establish professional ethical codes. And I've talked earlier about ethics and counseling, and that's what it's all about. You need to apply ethical principles when it comes to counseling. And then also the mechanism of accountability, because you as a counselor, you are accountable to what's going to happen with the client. So it's very important to have that sense of accountability which a counselor counselor have to adhere to. Then also legal and other support services, because a client needs to know that it's not just a psychological service that you can give, but also legal services, and especially when it comes to rape cases where a client comes in and then the next step, the client has to face the perpetrator or the person that did harm to him or her. So it's very important that you have to bring in that synergy between counseling and the legal aspect. And then of course is what other recommendation is, you have to promote mostly the support to the community and how you can apply psychological counseling services to the community and then become a project. There are certain elements that you have to look through, which is very important when it comes to HIV, and specifically we're going to look at HIV prevention counseling. There are certain guidelines which is giving, and I'm quickly going to go through them. The first thing is you have to be focused when you counsel somebody on HIV. You have to make sure that the counseling is not just shallow, but it's in depth, it's very personal, and you are looking at the personal risk of the person. The other thing that you have to look at is to make sure that the client feel that there is support from your side and there is this positiveness, this energy that you are actually giving to the client, that you are very positive about his or her situation. And then also, which is very important, as I said, general misconception. Don't generalize the problem, but be specific, be personal. And then of course, which is important, is then you need to negotiate with the client to look at that the problem of HIV, it's a behavioral problem, and how can the client make a decision to make the right change and to have a right behavior. And then of course, looking at other preventional approach method, and then also provide a sense of skill building, an opportunity to the client to build his or her skill. And of course, which is very important, you need to use the right language. There are other HIV counseling interventions which one is taking, and there is 4 of them, but there might also be others. These are different methodologies that you can use, or different kind of HIV counseling that you can do. So I'm quickly going to go through them. The first one is what we call the VCT, or the famous voluntary counseling and testing. People coming voluntary for testing, and then to know their HIV test status. And during that counseling, you've got pre-test counseling and you've got post-test counseling. The pre-test counseling is you counsel the person before the test, you do the test, and after the test you do post-test counseling, where you then divulge or share the results of the testing. So that's the voluntary counseling and testing intervention. The second intervention is provider-initiated counseling and testing, where you as a provider, you initiate, where you give the services to a client or to a company, where employees can also go through this counseling session. And then of course you've got the couples HIV counseling testing, and it actually, all these interventions you can synergize them, because with the voluntary counseling, if you know that you are HIV positive, then the counselor will normally encourage you to go and get your partner. Your partner comes with you, they go through the counseling, and this is where the couple HIV counseling goes through, that you with your boyfriend, your girlfriend, or your husband and wife, together as a couple, you go for counseling and testing. And then of course prevention for positive, it's also another intervention where you look, especially when you're already HIV counseling. There are different needs which are very important for counseling. The most important thing is counseling create an environment where the person can feel that he or she can be healed. And it's very important that you have to look, when you are going to look at counseling, it's very important that you have to look at the 4 key elements. And normally counseling is focusing at stress management. How do you manage your stress? And then also, how do you cope cope with your situation, which is coping skill. Education you need to be aware, you need to be knowledgeable about your situation and not ignorant. And then of course the other element is then how do you build positive relationship, especially when you find yourself in a very domestic and a violent relationship. So there are 5 stages where you can also counsel, and I will take an example of counseling young people. And it's, you have to know the client or the teen, you have to discover what is their needs, you have to come up what do you want to achieve during this counseling session, the goals, you have to come up with a plan, and then to look at how are you going to progress from there to make sure that there is progress. The final chapter in this module is we're going to look at the community, and it's very important that in psychological counseling you are dealing with the community, and these services have to be extended to the community, especially those community that are infected and affected with HIV/AIDS, and which are very vulnerable. And you have to look at these different areas. The first thing is you have to look at the prevalence of the HIV within this community. You have to look at stigma and discrimination among the community, and then you have to prepare the community for psychological counseling. And this is also peer counseling, group therapy or group counseling, and your approach needs to be very participatory so that you can create that awareness and involve the community. And of course, when the community is aware about the problem, and then you can then start to come with a plan of action where you mobilize the community for action. So you empower the community, and then you help the community to come with a plan so that they can then implement programs or services on psychological counseling, especially for those people that are infected and affected. So that's the end of my session. I will then encourage you to go through your IOL study manual for more information, and I hope that you will be ready for your assignments and then also for your exam. Thank you very much.